Happy New Year and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the January 2025 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past couple of months since our last webinar back in November. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. Joining us today, we're pleased to have Karen Gleason from NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information, who will be giving us a recap of the weather and climate in the Southeast over the past year. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next couple of days. All right, so we got a lot to cover, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. Next slide. All right, so let's start with a recap of temperatures from December, which show near normal to slightly below normal temperatures across much of the region. A few spots there that were a bit above average. It was warm yet again across the U.S. Caribbean, with San Juan recording its second warmest December on record and St. John recording its fourth warmest December on record. Okay, next slide. But as is often the case this time of year, mean temperatures don't tell the complete story. Over the past couple of months, we've seen a number of different weather patterns across the region that have contributed to much variability in temperature. On the left, we see the daily maximum temperatures reach 70 degrees across the northern tier of the region, with some parts of Florida approaching 90 degrees, while minimum temperatures there on the right dropped below freezing as far south as central Florida, with large portions of the region dropping into the teens, in some places dropping into the single digits, especially over the last couple of weeks. Okay, next slide. In fact, if we look at the month of January to date, we see that most locations are running between 5 and 10 degrees below average, which may not sound all that impressive, but in fact, there are numerous locations which have been or currently are on track to record one of their 10 coldest months on record, including Gainesville, Florida. I'll highlight Gainesville, which is actually quite close to matching its coldest month on record, which was set all the way back in January of 1977. On the flip side, temperatures this month remain above average across much of the U.S. Caribbean, with San Juan again on track to record this time one of its warmest Januaries on record. Okay, next slide. So since our last webinar, we've seen at least one significant severe weather outbreak. Over 45 tornadoes touched down from southern Alabama to North Carolina. This was towards the end of December, though the full extent of the outbreak actually extended all the way down to southeast Texas, as we can see here. 2 people were injured near Montgomery, Alabama, when a mobile home overturned. If we go further north, there was significant damage to the downtown area of Athens, Alabama. That actually garnered national media attention. And several tornadoes touched down in the Atlanta metro area during this event, with multiple injuries reported due to falling trees. Okay, next slide. So looking at precipitation, we see that many locations were below normal in December, except there was a ribbon there across southern portions of Alabama and Florida and across the interior of the region, stretching from, say, northern Georgia through western Virginia. A couple of storm systems in the middle and at the end of December dropped several inches of precipitation across these areas, and that resulted actually in some places recording up to double their expected monthly totals. Okay, next slide. And looking at precipitation since the beginning of January, we see that many of the places that were wet in December are now actually running quite dry. And in fact, several locations across the interior and northern portions of the region are on track to record one of their driest Januaries on record. In contrast, precipitation has been above average across much of the Gulf Coast, while precipitation has been near normal across much of the U.S. Caribbean, with some parts of the Virgin Islands running maybe a bit drier than normal. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is what everyone was waiting for. Of course, the big story over the past couple months has been the return of snow and winter weather to the region. As you can see on the left, a large portion of the continental U.S. has seen accumulating snowfall so far this season. Though if we look on the right, we see that these amounts are actually below, for the most part, below their 30-year normals, in particular across the high plains and parts of the Intermountain West. While the snow that has fallen recently across the southeast, especially along the Gulf Coast, was well above the expected amounts and was, in fact, record breaking in some cases, as we'll talk about here in a second. Okay, next slide. So while we did see some snow across central portions of North Carolina back in early December, the first real widespread event occurred on the evening of January 10th and into the early morning hours of January 11th. Most places stretching from parts of central Alabama through central North Carolina picked up about 1 to 3 inches of snow, marking the first measurable snow in 3 years and actually ending some long running snow droughts, including the second longest snow drought on record at the Raleigh Durham Airport. Parts of the northern Piedmont and foothills, as well as southern and eastern portions of Virginia, saw 4 to 6 inches of snow, while some of the higher elevations in northwest North Carolina picked up even more than that. The lower amounts across the central and eastern Piedmont were partially due to the fact that the snow transitioned eventually to sleet and freezing rain, which left a layer of ice ranging from about 1/10 of an inch in most places to over 1/4 of an inch around the Charlotte area. Okay, next slide. And so less than 2 weeks later, a rare snowstorm impacted parts of the Gulf Coast, stretching from Houston to the Florida Panhandle and far eastern portions of the Southeast. That included the coastal plain of Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, where many locations recorded anywhere from 5 to 10 inches of snow. Mobile recorded over 7 inches, breaking the record for the most snow over a 2-day period that had stood since 1895. In Florida, there were multiple reports of 10 inches around the Pensacola area. And if verified, this would shatter the state's 24-hour snowfall record of 4 inches that was set in nearby Milton, Florida back in March of 1954. A few locations along the Outer Banks recorded over 8 inches of snow, which is the most snow there in nearly a decade. And even parts of southeastern North Carolina, places like Holden Beach and Ocean Isle Beach, saw their biggest snowstorm from this event in over 35 years. This event was also part of a region-wide cold outbreak where temperatures dropped into the teens along the Gulf Coast, with some single digits across southern portions of Alabama and Georgia. Mobile bottomed out at 6 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of the 22nd, which tied for the third coldest temperature ever recorded in Mobile, and that's in a record going back over 150 years. That day, the temperature only got to 38 degrees in Gainesville, Florida, which was the coldest maximum temperature recorded there in about 15 years. Okay, next slide. So turning our attention to the drought monitor, we've seen a mix of improvements and degradations across the region over the past couple of months. Conditions have improved across much of Alabama, Georgia, and Northwest Florida, as well as parts of the interior of the region where we've seen above average precipitation. But in places that have missed out, such as the Florida Peninsula and eastern portions of the Carolinas, we've seen drought emerge or worsen. Or in the case of eastern Tennessee, we've seen areas of severe and extreme drought persist through the first part of the winter. And though not shown here, the U.S. Caribbean continues to be free of any drought or abnormal dryness, which is good news as we head into the heart of their dry season. Okay, next slide. All right, so the La Nina waiting game is officially over. La Nina conditions finally emerged in the tropical Pacific back in December, and there's about a 6 in 10 chance that they will persist for the next several months, then transition back to neutral conditions sometime this spring. As we pointed out last time, this La Nina is expected to be a weak event, as shown in the model forecast plume there on the right. Since this La Nina has developed late in the season, our recent temperature pattern that we discussed earlier has been driven really by other modes of climate variability, such as the Arctic Oscillation and the Pacific North American pattern, which have allowed very cold air to spill into the region this winter. And this is not uncommon during La Nina events. You may recall the cold outbreak that affected the southern plains, especially Texas and parts of the southeast back in February of 2021. And that event occurred during a moderate La Nina. Okay, next slide. So because of the expectation that La Nina conditions will persist for the next several months, the seasonal projections from the Climate Prediction Center show sort of the expected pattern of above average temperatures across the southeast, with below average precipitation across the southern and eastern parts of the region, and some above average precipitation across the interior. That includes northern Alabama and much of Tennessee. Okay, next slide. So looking across the Caribbean, the seasonal outlooks continue to advertise above average temperatures and precipitation across the region over the next few months. Next slide. And the seasonal drought outlook closely mirrors these projections, with drought persisting and expanding across the southern and eastern portions of the southeast, with improvements expected across the interior of the region. And as you can see there, the U.S. Caribbean is expected to remain free of any drought over the next several months. Okay, next slide. So there's been much talk lately about a pattern change on the horizon, and we see that as we head into this weekend and early next week. Above average temperatures are strongly favored, with precipitation leaning above average across, say, the northern tier of the region, and perhaps some below average conditions across much of Florida and extreme southern Georgia. Okay, next slide. And if we look out to later next week, we see a continuation of above average temperatures, with precipitation leaning above average across nearly all the region except parts of Florida, or except most of Florida and extreme southern Georgia. Okay, next slide. And as we get into mid-February, it's looking like above average temperatures will persist across the region, with wetter than normal conditions across the northern tier and drier conditions across the southern tier. And with that, we should be at the summary slide next. There we go. There's the summary for you to look over after the webinar. I want to acknowledge our service climatologist, William Schmitz, for all his hard work in putting this information together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Todd for our water resources update.
Well, thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and get started and get this done quickly. Go ahead and go on to our next slide. And we're going to start talking about the 28-day average stream flows across the southeast. And so on the left-hand side, you can see the 28-day average stream flows, and our yellows and our reds indicate below normal stream flows across some of the area. And you can see North Carolina, parts of Virginia, and then you skip over kind of Georgia, although South Carolina is a little drier too. Georgia's more close to normal and kind of a mix of everything. And then Alabama and Tombigbee, those areas are also a little bit drier. And so you've got this, dichotomy of different areas that are dry. And that's kind of the tale of the southeast over the last year, is that we've had a lot of up and down. Either we've had a lot of rain or we've had none. That's what it feels like anyway. And so as you look on the right-hand side, you can see over the last 2 years kind of what that's looked like. And this is the stream flow over the whole southeast. And you can see we've had some highs, we've had some lows. We've actually dipped down over the last month or so. And while we've been cold especially in the last month, we really haven't had a whole lot of rain. We've been a little bit below average, as was mentioned, and so there are some spots that are still, as you can see from the left-hand side and the stream flows across the region, they're a little bit different. So now we'll go and look with the next slide and start talking about the specific states. And as we start to look at the states and what they look like, and you can see that Alabama, again, very up and down especially during the last 4 or 5 months, as we've gotten heavy rains and then we've gotten dry again. But we are starting to wet up again, and this is the time of year when we would expect to get more rainfall and start to recharge. And you can see that in the averages and how those go up. So Alabama, we're starting to warm up. We're still in the normal range, Georgia is very much the same way. They've stayed a little bit more wet during this time and are continuing to be wet. Those stream flows in Georgia continue to be wet. Florida is very odd, as we've had tons of rainfall during the hurricane season and during their wet season, and has dropped off very, very quickly. And so they have dropped off very quickly because they haven't seen as much rain and they're in their dry season. So they've at least gotten a little bit of a break from all that rainfall, but they have had a little bit of recent rainfall over parts of Florida, and so that has improved conditions. So let's go ahead and look at and go on to the Atlantic coast and look at the next slide. And what you'll find when we start to look at the next slide is South Carolina. Again, same pattern as we've seen across the rest of the Southeast, but they're now in the normal range right now. The eastern and southern part, or the western part, has been a little bit wetter, and the eastern part and northern part has been a little bit drier. So we have a mix in there. As for North Carolina, it's the same thing along the mountains. We've been a little bit more wet, but most of the state, the plains and the coastal area, are seeing a little bit drier. So we're just barely above the below average in the state. And the same can be said for Virginia, as Virginia has seen improvements recently, but just barely above what we would be below average in those areas. So let's look at where we are. Let's go to the next slide and look and see where we are with river flooding across the Southeast, because typically during this time of year, we would start to see a lot more river flooding. So a normal year would see a decent amount of floods across the Southeast. And what you see is a couple of action level rises in the area. And one of them is in Georgia, and then a couple along that area that got the snow and the rainfall from Mobile to Jacksonville. We've got two places that are in action stage. So this is a little bit unusual. We would usually expect to see some flooding during this time. And so when we start to talk about above normal and below normal, right now this would place us below normal, as we usually see some flooding. So let's move on to the next slide, which talks about our climatology across the Southeast. And we are on week 4 of the year. And again, as I mentioned before, this is the time of year we should be ramping up and seeing recharge in the soils and seeing our reservoirs and our rivers start to fill in, that we should start to see those fill up. Now, while the reservoirs are right now not in too bad a shape over a lot of the area, we can see that there are some, in the very first slide, we saw that there are some impacts across the Southeast, and some of these stream flows, which are supposed to be getting higher, they're typically higher this time of year, are not going up as much as they normally would. And so it's something we have to watch through the rest of this year, because it will be a concern as we get into February and March. For February, though, you can look the next few weeks, we tend to have a lull, and it's March that becomes very, very important as we end spring or end winter and go into spring, and look for those recharging, for that recharge in that area. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide, which is going to talk about Florida. Florida is in its dry season right now, and it has been very dry. And the only time we typically get a lot of rain or above normal rain is during El Nino years. And we are not in that. We are in a La Niña now, and that's typically dry for that time of year. So that's part of the reason we've seen all of the drying out. So we would not typically expect to see much flooding down there or a whole lot of rain. They did get their rain during the tropical season and during their wet season, but they are drying out like they're supposed to. So let's go to the outlook for the next few months, for February through April, which is on the next slide. And you'll see that we've got a below normal risk for river flooding as we get into Alabama, Tombigbee, and all that area. And as we get up into South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, also below normal. Sort of normal risk for river flooding. And the same for Florida. You saw that some of those points in there, and normal means there's not a whole lot of flooding. We're not expecting any flooding, so that's kind of why that's showing normal in that area, especially because rivers are in decent shape. But just because it's a below normal risk for flooding doesn't mean that those floods can't happen. Things can change very quickly, and while the forecast does not look like that now, we know that it can change very quickly, and that and things can turn very quickly. So you just have to be very careful with that. So let's move on to the summary slide, which is next. and you can read this later, and then and we will go ahead and pass it off to Pam then.
All right. Well, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Elliot, for running the slides. Just keep going on. There we go. Um, you might think this time of year there's not a lot going on in agriculture, but actually, a lot of farmers are very busy right now getting ready for the next growing season. And some farmers, of course, down in Florida, they're doing plenty of agriculture, and along the coastal areas of South Carolina and even in Georgia and Alabama, they're doing some agriculture as well of winter crops. One of the things we've noticed is that even though we've had a lot of snow, the snow water content has not been that high. So dry conditions are really showing up across a lot of the region, as Chris showed in the drought maps, and you'll see that a little bit in just a minute as well. The very cold temperatures that we've had, going down to as low as 15 or even lower in some places, have caused problems for citrus and other crops in Florida and southern Georgia. I know the ones in Georgia, we're working really hard to get the satsumas harvested before the southern snow fell a week or so ago. It's especially hard on the younger plants that have just been planted because they haven't had the time to develop the cold hardiness yet. And so that has been an issue. Usually they can take it to about 15 degrees, but if it gets below that, then there start to be more problems. A lot of the strawberries that are being grown in South Carolina have had to be covered, and that brings some issues about trapping of moisture inside, and so they're having some problems with fungal diseases. The cold air is also contributing to the reduction in pest and disease carryover from last year, so that's one good thing about it. When we have really warm winters, that doesn't always happen, and that means that farmers have to work harder to apply pesticides and herbicides in the next growing season. The snow cover and ice has caused some damage to trees and blueberry bushes, especially in northern Florida and southeast Georgia. And so those are some of the things that are happening now. Some crops are doing just fine. I've seen some great pictures of collard greens that have been covered by snow, and they are doing just fine. They haven't really had any damage at all. So let's go on and talk about, this thing is slow. Surface water, or the surface temperatures, as you might expect, are quite a bit below normal. This is based on the last week, which of course has been very cold. So this will be moving upward over time. And the only place that is not really cold is the southern tip of Florida, which has really been missed by the coldest air. Soil temperatures across most of the region, this is the top meter of soil, have been quite dry, especially if you look in eastern North Carolina. They've really had a lot of problems with dryness there. And western Alabama, those areas are really increasing the amount of drought that's going on there. It's an issue that we have to watch carefully going into the next growing season, because if soil moisture is too dry, then the seeds don't germinate very well. And you can see the exception of that is southeast part of Georgia and northern Florida, where they're still feeling the impacts of that recent snow and rain event. We go on. One of the things that I like to look at this time of year is chill hour accumulation. And we were really kind of following along last year's pattern of chill hour accumulation until we got to the second week in January, where the colder air really allowed it to accelerate upward. So you can see now the chill hours for peaches and blueberries are quite a bit ahead of what they were last year. Not quite to the long-term average yet, although in some scenarios, the coldest years, we follow the top part of that red area. With the coldest years, we could see chill hours increasing even more than the long-term average. I don't think that's going to happen based on what Chris said about the forecast of much warmer conditions, but we're still probably going to end up higher than we were last year. And so the chill hour accumulation has increased a lot. The warmer weather is expected to slow that down. And if you are a producer and you like to use something called chill portions instead of chill hours, I just wanted to mention that AgroClimate now has a chill portion calculator. You have to be in Florida or Georgia, I think, to use that, but that's a nice additional product that they've just put out. So I would encourage you to go take a look at that. For consistency, I'm just going to keep to the chill hour accumulation. If we go on, Chris already showed a version of this. I'm just showing it for the last month. This is the lowest one-day minimum temperature, and you can see that a lot of the southern part of the region has gotten down in the 10 to 20 degree range. If you're below that, it's gotten even lower, or it's gotten into the 20 to 30 degree range. Of course, anywhere up farther to the north has really gotten down to cold temperatures. Again, the exception is South Florida, which is kind of its own little climate. That will be something that we'll have to watch as well. I don't anticipate we're necessarily going to get that cold again anytime this winter, but we could still get winter outbreaks even into March, and so we'll just have to watch that. We go on. Next thing I want to talk about, once the slide changes, is frost dates. It seems kind of early to be talking about frost dates, but frost dates for late January are that bright orange color. You can see the average frost date for most of the Florida peninsula is this week or next week. And so, we're creeping up on the average last frost date. That means half of them will occur earlier and half will occur later. And so if you're down in that part of the region, I'm sure you're thinking about that now. Are we going to see any more frost? And it's really, I think, a little too early to say. For the next couple weeks, it looks pretty warm. But as I said, we still have some winter to go, so we'll be watching that carefully. One of the things that I'm really concerned about this year is that if we do have a warm spell, we've had plenty of chill hour blueberries that may come out of dormancy, and they would be then especially susceptible to a frost that occurs, even if the frost isn't really later than usual. If it's out of sync with the development stage of the blueberries, that could cause some issues. So I'm watching that carefully. I'm not going to say it's going to happen or not, but I think it's something that we really need to watch carefully. So let's go on. And here's my summary, and I'm going to just leave it at that because I want to make sure we give plenty of time for Karen. And so I am happy to have Karen come in, and she's going to introduce herself and talk about 2024. So take it away, Karen.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks for having me again this year. I think this is the third or the fourth year I have reviewed the climate of the Southeast, looking from an annual perspective. Again, my name's Karen Gleason. I'm the chief of the monitoring section at NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information. And we're going to take a kind of a bird's eye view of some of the highlights of 2024. Next slide, please. As you likely already know, the U.S. had its warmest year on record during 2024. And so the overall anomaly value was about 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit above the long-term mean. And we saw some of the largest temperature departures from average greater than 5 degrees from across portions of the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, Northeast, and South. We had 17 states, some of them in the South, and then, of course, from the upper Midwest to the Northeast and down into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys. All states but 2 were among their 5 warmest years on record, which is pretty remarkable. Next slide, please. Now we're zooming here into the Southeast and taking a look at our Climate at a Glance time series and county map plots. We see that the region was also warmest on record for the year and tied with 2019. The departure was 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above the long-term mean. The record warmth in the map on the right, you can see across parts of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and from northern North Carolina northward into Virginia, and of course that extends further to the north. Next slide. Breaking down the year sort of by season, we see the warmth was relatively persistent throughout the year across the Southeast, certainly in the winter and summer providing some near to above average temperatures. Spring and fall were regionally the most homogeneous, with much above average temperatures dominating the region. Areas of record warmth can be seen in pockets of eastern North Carolina in the spring, Florida during the summer, and along the Gulf Coast in the fall. Temperature departures ranged from about 2 degrees Fahrenheit above average in the summer to 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit above average during both the spring and the fall season. So consistency throughout the year is sort of the overall takeaway with temperature. Next slide. Pivoting now to precipitation. across the US, we see that overall it was an above average year. Areas where precipitation was above average included portions of the West Coast, Central Rockies, the Deep South, certainly the Southeast, and from the upper Midwest into parts of the Northeast. Drier than average conditions dominated portions of the Southwest, the Northern Rockies, Central Appalachians, and parts of the Mid-Atlantic. Next slide. So we're going to zoom in like we did for temperature to the southeast and look at precipitation time series over time, as well as our county map. And we see it was also above average for the year at more than 3.5 inches above the long-term mean. Parts of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia saw above to much above average precipitation averaged throughout the year. And if we look at the next slide, we break this down season by season, and we do see some variation on wet and dry periods throughout the year. Winter, spring, and fall were wetter than average, and summer was overall near average. During the winter, much above average precipitation could be seen across central North Carolina and eastern Virginia. Spring was near to and wetter than average across much of the southeast, except for central and southern Florida. During the summer, there was a pattern shift as dry conditions dominated western and northern parts of the region. Coastal Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, as well as parts of Florida, had above to much above average precipitation. And during the fall, we saw above average precipitation across western Tennessee, parts of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and a large portion of Georgia and Florida. All right, next slide. We're going to shift our attention now to drought across the Southeast. And we see the time series for the spatial extent of drought throughout the year, showing the ebb and flow of the various drought periods. The year began with about 30% of the region in moderate to extreme drought, primarily across the western and northern portions of the Southeast. Precipitation during the winter did bring some relief to the drought, with only small portions of Tennessee remaining in moderate drought going into the spring. By summer, drought emerged across southern Florida, and by late June, also emerging across much of Virginia, North Carolina, and parts of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida. Drought reached a peak for the year at approximately 53% of the region that was impacted by moderate to extreme drought, which you can see from the map on the lower right. The most intense drought of the year, D3 extreme drought, peaked on July 16th and covered about 3% of the region. By mid-August, only pockets of drought remained across Alabama and Tennessee, with more intense drought focused on West Virginia and Northern Virginia. A secondary peak extent of drought occurred towards the end of the year on December 10th, when about 52% of the region was impacted by mostly moderate drought, and primarily across the states of Alabama, North Carolina, and Virginia, with pockets of more intense drought across Tennessee. All right, moving on to the next slide. We see that drought was less of a concern across Puerto Rico in 2024, with drought peaking on January 23rd at about 54% and tapered off from there with the majority of the year drought free. So that was good news across Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Now we're going to be pivoting to the North Atlantic hurricane season, which certainly I'm going to say is probably like the big headline of the year, partly because I was in a bullseye, but we'll get to that in a second. We saw overall for the season 18 named storms, which is tied for the 5th highest in a year. And there were 11 hurricanes in all. 5 were major and 2 of those were category 5s. There were 5 landfalling hurricanes, which is tied for the 4th highest number of landfalling hurricanes on record. And those storms included Beryl, Debbie, Francine, Helene, and Milton. The primary tracks for the season included a flurry of activity located primarily in the Caribbean and the Gulf, which likely contributed to the higher number of landfalling storms that we saw. Next slide, please. Before I get too deep into the official hurricane totals, I wanted to highlight a storm that wasn't included in the count, which was potential tropical cyclone 8. It didn't quite get all the way there in time before it made landfall, if I remember correctly. And it came ashore near the Cape Fear, Wilmington region of North Carolina in mid-September. It produced really extreme heavy rainfall rates with banding of deep convection that produced upwards of 12 to 18 inches of rainfall over a 12-hour plus period. These rates actually put the localized event in the 1 in 200 year to 1 in 1,000 year recurrence interval intensity range, which is pretty intense. Carolina Beach had, for the entire event, nearly 21 inches of rain reported, and Southport just over 19 inches. So some pretty extreme rainfall with this potential tropical cyclone. Next slide. So I'm biased, of course, but I'm going to say that probably the big event of the year was Hurricane Helene. And I'm sure you've all heard plenty of things about Helene. We're still hearing about Helene. It made landfall as a Category 4 storm in the Big Bend region of Florida near the end of September. And it caused significant surge and flooding along the coast, and it proceeded onshore, traversing Georgia, western North Carolina, and eastern Tennessee. Widespread damage occurred from Florida into the mountains of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, with the most significant damage occurring throughout much of western North Carolina, which happens to be where NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information is headquartered and where I live. Agricultural losses in Georgia. I didn't want to not mention this because this was a pretty big deal, and I'm sure Pam's talked about this in prior webinars. But in Georgia alone, their losses were in the billions of dollars. Helene was the costliest event across the U.S. during 2024, with an estimated total damage cost of $78.7 billion, and this number is likely to increase as additional information continues to be gathered and assessed. As you can see from the map on the right, areas shaded in the darkest blue, it might look black as well. They received enough precipitation during this event that placed the entire areas in that darkest shade in the 1 in 1,000 year event category. So pretty widespread, very historic rainfall. And of course, as you can imagine, and as you've probably seen, this was a widespread catastrophic flooding event, especially when considering how the rainfall received at the higher elevations in these regions moves into the valleys. So essentially the valley gets exponentially higher runoff than the mountains, of course, the higher up. And this amplifies the already historic rainfall that occurred throughout the region. Next slide. And furthermore, flooding and damage from Helene, just to kind of break this down a little bit with this wonderful graphic that provided by the CW3E folks that track a lot of the atmospheric river events. This was really a 1-2 punch. The rainfall from the entire event was associated with a predecessor rain event, what they call a pre-event, in the days just preceding Helene's landfall. And this set up right along the Appalachian mountain range. A frontal boundary stalled to the west of the mountains, and low-level winds from the Gulf helped pump copious amounts of moisture into the region, causing a concentrated major rain event, very much like you would see in a West Coast atmospheric rain event. Prior to Helene's landfall, locations in the region shaded in green on the map received upwards of 5 to 10 inches of rain in a 24 to 48 hour period, and this caused localized flash flooding in some locations. And so once Helene made landfall in the ensuing day or two, additional record amounts of rain and tropical storm to hurricane force winds created catastrophic and widespread damage across the region. Next slide. So storm total rainfall amounts ranged widely, but many of the locations across upstate Georgia, South Carolina, western North Carolina, parts of eastern Tennessee, and western Virginia received 8 to 12 inches of rain. Some locations on the southern and eastern slopes that took the brunt of the wind and the rain had more than 18 inches of rain, and some locations higher elevations as well, as much as 20 to 30 inches total for the event. This event became the storm of record, exceeding rainfall and flooding levels in western North Carolina that had been achieved during the historic flood of 1916. The yellow star near the center of the map indicates where NCEI headquarters is located in downtown Asheville, and our downtown gauge reported more than 15 inches of rain for the event. The yellow star to the southeast of Asheville is approximately where I live. And we received a 3-day storm total of just over 18 inches, which I have never, ever in my life experienced before. In fact, the morning Helene hit, I had to wait to empty the gauge because it was too dangerous to be outside, too windy. And so I had about a 25-hour total in my CocoRa's gauge, and it was just right at 10 inches that day. And I've never had that much rain accumulate in approximately a day. Hope to never see it again as well. Next slide. So official totals from the Weather Service in Greenville-Spartanburg, they issued a map, and the most significant rainfall totals for this region were located in the upstate of South Carolina, northeastern Georgia, and the mountains of western North Carolina, and it peaked in the 20 to 23 inch range. Next slide. And this is my last slide on Helene. I know I've probably overdone it, so I appreciate you allowing me to indulge a little bit, but it was a pretty big deal. So impacts from Helene were far-reaching, from flash flooding to mudslides and landslides. Roads and bridges washed away or were severely damaged. Mature trees snapped or were uprooted by the winds and supersaturated soils. Power, internet, cell service were out across the region for days to weeks in some locations. Even Asheville's water supply was disrupted for weeks as pipes that brought water from the reservoir to the city were destroyed. And after many weeks of recovery and accounting for missing residents, at least 219 people lost their lives as a result of the storm. This was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane since Maria in 2017 and the deadliest to strike the U.S. mainland since Katrina back in 2005. The photo on the left was taken by a colleague of mine near Biltmore Village, if you're familiar with the entrance to Biltmore Estate here in Asheville, showing how the flooding dammed debris against a railway bridge. And the photo on the right is interesting for me in particular because it shows a before and after picture near an I-40 interchange in Asheville. And I drive this road to work every day when I come into the office. So kind of gives you some perspective on that. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, and we will pivot to another significant hurricane that happened less than 2 weeks after Helene made landfall, and that was Hurricane Milton. Came along shore near Tampa, Florida, so a little bit further south in Florida as a Category 3 storm on October 9th. And days prior to this landfall, it had strengthened into an intense Category 5 storm in the Gulf and was the strongest tropical cyclone to occur worldwide during 2024. Milton quickly traversed Florida before heading into the Atlantic and produced about 46 tornadoes in all and was associated with widespread flooding. Rainfall received during this hurricane ranged from a 1 in 50 year to a 1 in 200 year event. Next slide. And speaking of tornadoes, for the year, for the U.S. as a whole, there have been at least 1,735 confirmed tornadoes, which is the second highest count on record. 2004 exceeded that, and they had 1,817. But when we look at EF2 plus intensity tornadoes, 2024 was the most active year that we've seen since the historic year back in 2011. And it was a big tornado year for Florida, where Milton set a record for the most tornadoes of any modern era outbreak for the state with 46. It was also, I'll mention, notable for Ohio, where they had 74 tornadoes during the year, which shattered a record set back in 1992 of 62 tornadoes. Next slide. Here's another view of the tornadoes that occurred during 2024, and you can see some of the long tracks associated with the tornadoes from Hurricane Milton in Florida. And you can also point out the red streaks in the central US, the 4 EF4s that did occur. The Southeast didn't have any EF4 intensity tornadoes confirmed during 2024, but the Elkhorn, Nebraska from April, Marietta, Oklahoma also in April, Barnsdall, Oklahoma in May, and Greenfield, Iowa also in May were the most intense for the year. Next slide. So speaking of disasters and high cost, high impact events, 2024 was a near record year for billion-dollar disasters, just one event shy of the record 28 events seen just last year. In all, this past year, there were 17 severe storm events, 5 tropical cyclones, 2 winter storms, a flooding event, a wildfire event, and 1 drought heat wave. Approximately 13 of these 27 events either occurred squarely in the Southeast or skirted the periphery of the region, and I highlighted those events. You can see them, ones connected to the Southeast. And in all for the year, the total estimated cost of $182.7 billion was the 4th highest on record, and we've been keeping track of these since 1980. And of course, the estimate of $182.7 billion could rise and likely will by several billion dollars as additional costs from the identified events are reported over time. And so next slide with that, I have my summary slide kind of highlighting the things that I picked out. I appreciate you indulging me with Hurricane Helene, but it's strange to be sort of a scorekeeper and keeping track of extremes across the nation and across the world, and then to kind of be at the center of what was going on. So yeah, just, something that, an event we'll never forget here. And fortunately, we were able to kind of get back online and get our reports put back together and reconstituted and get our data flowing again because we had some disruptions. But with that, I will send it back to Elliot and we can take some questions if we have some time. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Elliot Wickham, the new Southeast DEWS coordinator for NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, or the NIDIS program. I want to say thank you to all of the presenters that we had today, Chris, Todd, Pam, and Karen. With that, we'll open it up for some questions. So feel free to put some questions in the chat. And while you're putting questions in the chat, I'd just like to recognize that this is a collaborative effort between the National Weather Service, the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and NIDIS, and the collaboration is most appreciated between the 3 entities to put this webinar on. So I'll open this up. I'll click on some of these here, and I got one for Pam, I think here. I noticed that the chill hour graph that Pam showed only went through January 17th. The winter weather last week will likely put us above for the year, maybe for the first time since 2010. Have you gotten? I'll ask Pam. Have you gotten any updated reports or anything like that about since the Arctic outbreak that we had last week come through?
I pulled the graph on Saturday when I had time to work on the slide, so I'm sure it's been updated since then. I would suggest going to AgroClimate and looking for those. If you're in Georgia, then the Georgia Weather Network also has their own calculator for chill hours, and so you can try georgiaweather.net as well to look for that. And I think Fawn in Florida also has a chill hour calculator. So they're being constantly updated. You can change the beginning and ending dates depending on what your needs are. But there are sources of information to get updated values available.
Thanks, Pam.
Yep.
Another question, I think this is geared towards Karen with some of the graphics that she showed, but did Florida have a record number of tornadoes in 2024?
I can't say for sure. I'm thinking it's a no, but associated with a specific event that was a record. So I'd have to do some digging to find that out for sure. Maybe someone else on the call knows that for sure. I'm thinking no, but like I said, for a specific outbreak or specific event, it was a record based on what I could find out.
Awesome, thank you. I'll open this up to, it might be more related to Pam and Chris, but this is specifically, or the person specifically asking for Georgia. What do weather patterns and events from last year, 2024, tell us about what we can expect for 2025? And I know that's a very interesting, but a little bit of a loaded question.
I'll jump in there. There's really no relationship from one year to the next statistically, although obviously it just depends somewhat on El Nino and La Nina. This winter has not been a very typical La Nina pattern in terms of the temperature, although it's been really quite good as far as precipitation goes. We have been drier than usual in the southern part of the region this year. Even though we've had snow and ice, water content for those hasn't been that high. Temperature values have been a little bit lower than average, partly because I think it really took a long time for La Nina to appear. A lot of the coldest temperatures in the Pacific Ocean are not in the eastern part this year, but are more in the central part. So that changes the wave pattern around the world. I think what I'm looking for is that we're likely to see another active hurricane season this year because we're going to be in neutral conditions. That doesn't mean they're going to all hit Florida. In fact, it seems it would be pretty unlikely that it would. But you just we can't predict past that far ahead. We can only say it's likely to be more active again.
Great, thanks, Pam. And then Karen, I'm going to kick it back to you. One question was, what theories on why the force, it's basically why Helene failed to dissipate after making landfall. If you can talk about what kind of set that up for the system, how it played out, if you're able to.
Yeah, I mean, I've just based on what I observed myself, because naturally I was watching this approach the coast because I knew what the projected path was. So I had personal interest in this. It had quite a bit of forward momentum, and it was a Cat 4 at landfall. So I think when you have, a fast approaching storm that is very intense. I want to say that if I'm not mistaken, it's remained a hurricane well through Georgia up towards Atlanta before it became a high-end tropical storm. And there definitely were hurricane force winds reported throughout some of the mountains and with some of the channeling in Western North Carolina. So you just had this really unique sort of storm of the century like setup where you had this predecessor rain event that really soaked an entire region that would then be vulnerable to having more rain, and then having tropical storm and hurricane force winds come across the region. And then as well, after it traversed Western North Carolina and kind of hooked back towards the west, so it actually moved westward, it kind of stalled out a little bit, and it started to spin down. So yeah, just a really intense storm coming on shore with a forward momentum that was pretty appreciable and significant, because I think it hit around 11 p.m. Eastern time in Florida, and by 3 to 4 a.m. we had lost power in Western North Carolina. So it did not take it long to kind of move through Georgia and come up through Western North Carolina. So that would be sort of my anecdotal assessment.
Thank you. I think we have, if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Just for everyone to know that we will, for all the participants today, we will send an email out with a link to the webinar recording that includes the key takeaways and a little recap or summary of the recording. Our next webinars in February, we'll be talking about citizen science and CoCoRaHS. And then in March, understanding NOAA's monthly and seasonal climate outlooks. And when the webinar is over, we have some post-webinar survey questions, feel free to fill those out in terms of content that you would think that we would like to cover, or you have any suggestions for us. And if you have any general questions, please reach out to me. My email is elliot.wickham@noaa.gov. I don't. Oh, I got one more question for you, Karen. If or anyone that wants to jump in, does anyone know what some of the wave, anyone know what the wave heights were during Helene? I'm assuming storm surge, that'd be my guess.
Yeah, I'd have to look that up. I don't have that handy, but I
Yeah.
know it was significant surge because we had a fast approaching Cat 4. I want to say it was, I'm, not 100% sure, but I want to say it was over 10 feet, 12 feet, something in that range, but I'd have to look up those stats. It was significant. There was significant surge with that particular landfall.
And
Okay.
if you're looking for actual wave heights, I would check with the National Data Boy um, Center because they have databases that would have that.
Great.
Hey, Elliot.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
Hey,
Victor
Victor.
from National Weather Service at Fort Worth. And yeah, I concur with Pam's answer, and also what Karen said. I don't have an exact value for you, but yes, it was quite significant. And on account of the path that the storm took, prior to making landfall, sort of running parallel to the West Coast, there was significant storm surge for a very, very large swath of the West Coast of Florida. I think roughly from Cedar Key area down southward to the Tampa Bay area. And I do think the Tampa Bay area had record high surge values from the event. Of course, it may have been broken by Milton a month or two later. But yeah, I do think the Tampa Bay area had record high surge levels, and the damage on account of that in the Tampa Bay area, even though it was rather far away from the landfall, was very significant.
Thanks, Victor. I have one question for Pam, and I know that this is a loaded question, but and I'm sure you've answered some of these in the past. Is there anything that you can talk about with some of the Hurricane Helene damage and some of the, like how that affected, with crop insurance and information like that?
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of questions about that. In fact, I'm giving a talk later this week down in South Florida about it. Hurricane insurance is something that um, has only been available for a few years, so they're kind of still working out the bugs in it, I think. But um, in Helene, what we saw was that the data sets that were chosen to verify the hurricane didn't necessarily match the actual observations that they were able to look at later. And because of the way the insurance is written, they have to use specific databases to verify whether or not you're eligible for insurance. It may be that they'll go back and recalculate some of that so that people that were not eligible before would be eligible. I don't think they'll take it away from anybody, but it's certainly an issue because they're trying to balance the high quality of data with getting payments out rapidly, and sometimes you have to make um, concessions to which of those you want to do. Either you want it to be right or you want it to be fast. And so that's something that I think they're still working on. Of course, right now, one of the bigger questions is whether or not a federal disaster program will continue. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that right now, but it's federal disaster payment. So that'll be something to look at as well.
Great. Thank you. And then we'll do one last question. We'll wrap it up. Question is, was there higher than usual tornado activity with Helene, specifically in mid-Georgia, but just I think overall, was tornado activity higher with this specific storm?
I'll start, and certainly others can contribute as well. I know that there was a lot of confusion about what some of the damage might have been due to. A lot of people were claiming that trees and debris were laid down in spirals, and but as far as like confirmed tornadoes, I don't know that there was anything exceptional that I'm aware of with respect to Helene. Maybe in Georgia, points further south, maybe that it was more significant. But I know at least in the western North Carolina area, there were a handful of tornadoes that had been confirmed. But honestly, the damage was so extensive, it really didn't matter if it was straight line winds or hurricane swirling or downbursts, which also were reported in the area. So, but yeah, I don't know that it was anything excessive or unusual with Helene. Maybe someone else on the call has more information about other regions between North Carolina and the Florida coast.
Yeah, this is Chris Furman. I can add a little bit to that. For Helene, as Karen mentioned, there was an EF1 tornado that occurred in Watauga County up in the mountains, and that was kind of a rare event according to the North Carolina State Climate Office. But we also had from one of the bands that came through eastern North Carolina, there was an EF3 tornado that caused some significant damage near Rocky Mount, North Carolina, which is in Wilson County. That's east of Raleigh. And that was, I believe, on the 27th. So that was kind of later in the event as one of those lines of storms was, or one of those, not outer bands, but one of the lines connected with what was left of Helene that was moving through, produced at least one tornado there. And I think from Helene in all throughout the Southeast, there were over 30 tornadoes confirmed. That's still less than what we had from Milton in Florida a month later, which was around, I think, 45 tornadoes. But regardless, both Helene and Milton were prolific producers of tornadoes, at least for tropical cyclones.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Karen. Well, with that, I appreciate everyone's questions and participation in the webinar today. Again, thank you so much to our presenters. And we look forward to seeing you again in February when we talk about citizen science and CocoRoss. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the month and February. Talk to you guys later. Thank you. Bye.